Good evening, everybody. Welcome to my first ever Togens Facebook Live fly tying demo. My name is Ken Woodward. I live in Kelowna, BC. I'm a retired middle school teacher, and I'm happy to be doing my first tying demo for Togens, and I hopefully will do some more for you sometime. Tonight I am going to tie a couple of my favorite scuds that I've had good success with fishing at Tunquil Lake and other lakes in the Kamloops region. As many people who know me know, I spend a lot of time at Tunquil Lake. In the last few years I've worked on fishing scuds a little more and really enjoy fishing them. Like many people, for a long time I didn't have much success with scuds. I had some in my box, but I didn't use them very often. But I would pump fish and I would discover that there were scuds in their throats, and eventually I decided to work a little harder on fishing scuds, and they've now become one of my favorite things to fish. Now I'm just noticing on my screen here that it says, sorry, we're having trouble playing this video. Can somebody please type a comment and tell me if they can see me right now? Oh, good. Okay. It's just I can't see what you guys are seeing, so I can see the comments, so that's great. Okay, good. So I am just going to first talk a little bit about the biology of scuds, and then I'm going to tie a couple of flies and then tell you how I fish them. So to switch to the slideshow here. Scuds or freshwater shrimp are arthropods like insects and other crustaceans, spiders, things like that, are all arthropods, jointed-legged, jointed exoskeleton. They're in the subphylum Crustacea, so they're crustaceans, and the ones we're interested in are in the order Amphipod, mainly in the genera Gammarus and Hyalella. The real big scuds that you see in lakes, especially the alkaline, very rich lakes, are typically Gammarus. They can be, half an inch or more in size. I've seen them up to almost 3/4 of an inch sometimes. It's a pretty big meal for a trout. Hyalella, the little tiny ones, and typically in more acidic sort of tannin lakes, really small, they can be like size 16s, 18s, 20s, kind of difficult to imitate. And I must admit, I rarely fish those. Gammarus is usually what I'm trying to fish. According to Phil Rowley, these crustaceans, Gammarus and Hyalella, comprise about 1/5 of a trout's diet, so they're a pretty important food source. They eat them all year, as you'll see in some of the throat samples I've got. The peak is typically in the fall. In fact, I love fishing scuds in the fall, but springtime can be a good time to fish in too. They're always available, and if there's nothing hatching, fish are probably going to be out in the weeds rooting around looking for scuds. They have a very simple life history. They start as an egg, which we don't imitate. They're too small, obviously. They hatch into juveniles, and then they go through a series of molts as they eat and grow until they become sexually mature adults. The juveniles and the sexually mature adults, don't really look much different other than size, although the females can get an egg sac in them that some people imitate with a little orange dot inside them. So here are some of your typical scuds. These ones, as you can see, are kind of a tanny gray color, which is fairly common. These ones probably are about maybe a size 16. There's some more about the same size, that sort of tanny gray color. One thing to notice is they have quite a shiny carapace on them, and they've got a lot of legs, but not the zillions of them, but they have quite a few, and they're obviously segmented. There's a little more close-up picture. The little one's a little more olivey, kind of brown olive. You can see that obvious segmentation and the multiple legs. Here are some pretty big ones. These would be big Gammarus with some smaller ones down in the bottom. You can see these ones are a little more of a brown olive sort of color. And then that big one that's spread out at the top, you can see about how many legs they have. They're not a zillion. Some more sort of brown olive scuds. As you can see by these samples, sometimes fish just focus on them. That's all that was in those throat samples is scuds. This throat sample you can see has a couple snails in it as well. So when they're down at the bottom and in the weeds rooting around eating scuds, you know, if they come upon a snail or something, they'll pick that up too. This throat sample shows you that sometimes fish, you know, even though they're eating other things almost exclusively, there's a whole bunch of chironomid pupae and some bloodworms in this sample. There's also some scuds in there. You know, if they see a scud, they'll eat it. For example, this one here, this sample has a bunch of Daphnia, a tiny little dragonfly nymph there on the right-hand side, a tiny damselfly nymph on the left-hand side. I think up in the back, all blurry there, is a boatman, but there's a scud sitting there again. So they're almost like the bowl of chips. You know, you just can't pass them up when you walk by. And you know, fish that live in lakes that eat lots of scuds tend to grow fast. You can tell they've been eating scuds because they usually have an orangey red flesh. They get the pigment from the scuds. And if you ever take a throat sample of the scuds and then leave them in the vial overnight and forget about them, they die, you'll often find they're kind of orange or pink the next day. And I think for a long time guys often would tie scuds orange or pink, not realizing that the naturals weren't that color. And if you want to see a big fish that was probably living mostly on scuds, there's one right there. This is a fish that I got down in Lago Strobel, also known as Jurassic Lake, down in Argentina. I was lucky to go there a couple of years ago. And these fish grow really big, really fast, and that's what they mostly eat in that lake is scuds. They're beautiful, big, beautiful fish. Okay, I'm just going to switch over to my iPhone here, which is pointing at my device here. If somebody can just throw a comment on there and tell me that they can see the fly, that would be great. So in the vise here, I have a size 14 Togens Scud hook with a 3/32 brass bead. You can use tungsten beads as well. It'll kind of just depend on, you know, how deep water fishing, how fast you want it to sink, and so on. I just put a brass bead on here for the sake of the demo today. And I am going to use some light olive UTC thread. Usually try to match the thread color and so on to the color of the scud that I'm tying. So I'm just going to start just thread behind the bead. Cut the waist thread. Now, I tie my scuds the way I learned from Phil Rowley how to tie them, which is a little bit different than the way a lot of people tie them. I'm going to tie the shellback in at the front to start with, and then I'll tie my wiring and everything in afterwards, and you'll see why in a little while. Scuds have a body part at the tail end called a telson, and I'm going to imitate that using the scud back material. So here I have some Togens Scud Back here. Let's see if I can get that in the screen in a light olive color, and I have notched it on top, put a little point in it to make it easy to tie in. Okay, so just going to carefully tie this in on the top. Yeah, okay, it's working. That's good. This is the finicky part, getting it right in on top. So I'm just pinching that little point that I cut right on top of the hook, and I'm making sure that the scud back is right on top. And you can see right there, it's just sitting right on top of the bead. Bind it down securely. Make sure it's right there. Good. Now I am going to take some light olive UTC wire, or golden olive actually, and I'm going to tie that in, and that's going to be my rib. And it's also going to secure the scud back down. Now you'll notice I'm going to stop just opposite the barb of the hook here. I'm not going to go down into the bend. A lot of people like to use straight eye hooks for scuds because when scuds are alive and swimming, they're straightened out. They're not all curved like they are when they're at rest. But especially for smaller hooks, I like the scud hooks because they have a wide gap and they're strong. They're typically a 2x or 3x strong. So I use the scud hooks, but I don't go all the way back. I stay up on top so that I'm only on the slightly curved part of the hook shank. Then I'm just going to bring my thread back up to the bead. And then I am going to grab some of this micro UV Polar Chenille. It's also in different packaging. You can get it as Straggle String. Different companies make it. It's basically a very, very sparse chenille. Works really good. And another thing I really like about it too is you notice the core is made out of the same thing as the straggly parts. It's a plastic as well. Unlike other kinds of crystal chenilles and so on, which have a rayon or cotton or something cord in the middle, which is opaque and often white, which doesn't look right to me. So this one, when it gets wet, it's nice and translucent, and it looks really good. So I'm just going to tie this in just behind the bead. And bind it down on the top of the hook shank. Again, till I get just where I finished the wire there, and bring my thread up to the bead. Now, since I have a rotary vise, I'm going to take advantage of it, so I am going to put a half hitch into my thread. Hang my thread on the bobbin rest there. Now I am going to take a turn behind the wire first. And then I'm going to come in front of the wire, and that's so that my first turn of wire won't be on the hook shank, but it'll just going to come up in amongst the body. Then I'm just going to wrap forward, and I'm going to stroke back the fibers with each turn so I don't trap them. It's quite sparse as it is, and I don't want to lose any of the legs. One nice thing about having a rotary vise is I can just make my wraps with my right hand and turn the vise with my left and not have to let go of the material. Then bind it down just behind the bead, a couple of turns, then clip the excess. I'm just going to move my thread to in behind the bead, another half hitch into it, and put my bobbin on the rest again. Now, I'm going to bring my wire underneath so my first turn comes from my side. Then I'm going to take this scud back, make sure I've pushed all the fibers down out of the way, and then stretch it down the back of the fly, keeping it centered right on top. I'm going to bring my first turn around, being careful to keep that right on top, like that. Maintaining tension on that wire. Then I'm going to wiggle the wire as I come through so that I don't trap the legs if I can avoid it. Keep it firm. And then I'm just going to keep going forward in open turns. Try not to let the wire slip out of my fingers. Making nice even segments if I can.
And you notice I'm trying to just push the legs out of the way as I come around so that I don't trap them. Okay, once I get behind the bead, bind it down with a couple turns. Break the wire with my thumbnail so I don't dull my scissors. Then I'm just going to build up just behind that bead to try to make the shellback almost kind of flush with the bead. Then I'll just do a whip finish. Clip my thread. Now I'm going to just tip the hook up here. Yeah, you guys can see that okay? Everybody's seeing all right? All right. And now here's the little trick that I learned from Phil Rowley. He's on, I think it was his crystal shrimp or pearl shrimp, I think. When I cut this, I'm going to cut it so that a little notch appears in the scud back, and that will imitate the telson of the fish. And I'll leave it sticking out a little bit. Some friends of mine also think that acts like a little fin, and when you're twitching it in, it can cause it to move around a little bit. So I'm going to pull on this stuff, and it'll curve so that I can now come in, if I can see, with my scissors, cut it on an angle like that. And you'll see, you should be able to see when I turn it, that there is a little notch left there. Hopefully you can see that on the camera. Okay. Then I'm just going to take some good old Sally Hansen's and put a little bit on the thread so that it doesn't get chewed by the fish. And then finally, I am going to take some resin, some UV resin, fairly thin stuff. I'm just going to paint a little bit on the bottom. Try not to get it into the body. I just want it to be on the back. And I'm not going to turn it right side up because I don't want it to drip down into it. Then take out my handy dandy UV light. Cure it. That should do the trick. And now you can see it even adds a little more translucency to the back there, and makes the colors blend a little bit. And that is a dandy little scud. The straggle gives it just the right number of legs. The UV feet, the UV part of the straggle looks a lot like the naturals, and it has good movement. This little fly stripped, in amongst the shallows and stuff, can be really deadly. So that's the Straggle Scud. Now, of course, I did things in the opposite order of what I expected or planned to do. I'm going to show you now a really simple scud. So if you don't have, scud back and things like that, or you don't want to go to all that trouble, this one here is one called, if I can get the hook in there, it's one called Pat's Shrimp. That's what I call it anyway. This is a pattern that I learned from a friend that I met at Leighton Lake a couple years ago. Now, just before, I'm just going to switch back over to the FaceTime camera here so you can see me.
Okay, so just before I tie this really simple fly, a couple years ago, a friend of mine who has a cabin on Layton Lake was out fishing one day, and there was a couple there who were just absolutely pounding fish. They were casting something in towards the reeds and just lighting it up. And my pal, who knows that lake like the back of his hand, was just watching them catch fish left and right while he was struggling, and it drove him crazy. Well, that next day, my wife and I happened to be over there too, and we saw a Northern Light camper parked in a campsite, and we have a Northern Light too. And typically, when you see somebody with a Northern Light, you know it's kind of a bit of a fraternity. You go over and have a chat with them, and so we walked over and we chatted away, and I discovered that they were the people who had been putting a clinic on for Johnny. And I said, hey, my buddy, you were driving him nuts there the other day, and what were you guys using? He goes, oh, just a simple little scud I tie. I'll show it to you. And so he showed it to me, and man, you couldn't believe you'll see how simple this thing is. And he was just lighting them up. So of course, I happen to have the materials back at our trailer, so I went back and tied myself up a half dozen, because you can tie them in no time at all, as you'll see. And the first half dozen I tied, I lost them in no time because fish just smashed them. So this little one here, if you want to have a bunch in your box when the fish are really keying on scuds, and especially if you're retrieving them fast, you're going to be getting broken off once in a while, and sometimes the fish aren't all that picky. If it's the right color and size, they're going to drill it. So this is one that Pat showed me and I just call it Pat Shrimp, and I got permission from him to show this to you. Very similar to other ones that I've seen people tie. In fact, I'm sure he's probably not the first one to ever tie it, and won't be the last. So same thing, start with a size 14 Togens scud hook with a little brass bead on, or you could use tungsten. And this is going to be quick and dirty. So going with the micro chenille again. Tie it in behind the bead. Throw in a half hitch. Oh, I got to switch to the fly. My wife just reminded me. Sorry. Got too focused. So I've got the 14 scud hook, 3/32 brass bead, the light olive thread, golden olive thread, and the light olive UV straggle. Okay, now I'm just going to wind this stuff to the back. This is where it's really nice having a rotary vise to just opposite the barb, and then again just wind it forward. And you see I'm wiggling it so that it doesn't mash down the fibers too much. Going twice like that gives it just a little bit more body. Clip the excess. Maybe I'll use my nice new Togens whip finisher here. And that's it. You can see there's nothing to that fly. If you want, you can stroke all these fibers down if you want to make it look a little bit more scuddish. Some guys will put thick UV resin on the back, but I'll tell you, I just tied them exactly like this. In fact, I didn't even stroke them down like that, and got soundly snapped off many times with this fly. So you can see, if you're not talking and getting distracted and stuff, you can knock these things off in like 30 seconds. So, tie yourself up some of these to have in the box. And, the nice thing too is they're quick and easy. You can tie them in multiple colors. You can get this Scud Back the Polar Chenille in multiple colors, or Straggle. This is an olive brown, which is not a bad imitation of the darker ones that you see. Here's a whole card
of a bunch of different colors. You can get them, you know, from white, tan, all the way on up to various shades of olive. Pretty cool. So now I'm going to go back to me again. Finally, what I want to talk about a little bit is how I fish these things. So typically I fish them in fall and spring. Sometimes in the summer if there's nothing going on, you know, if there's nothing hatching and I see fish rolling up in shallow water or in amongst the weeds, I figure they're in there looking for something, and there's a real good chance it's scuds, or they'll certainly eat one if they see one. So I'm usually fishing them in, you know, sort of 1 foot to about 6-8 feet depth water most of the time. My favorite is in that, you know, shallow 2-3 foot water in the spring and in the fall, because the fish just go hog wild then. And you know, it's big fun, that big yank when you get the take. So depending on the depth of the water, I'll use anywhere from a floating line with a long leader, you know, floating line, long leader, and a tungsten bead. They'll get down, you know, just nicely and just stay right at the right depth. I love my Rio hover line. That's probably the one I use the most when I'm fishing scuds in less than 4 or 5 feet of water. You know, 2-3 feet, that hover's just beautiful. And then if it's getting to be a little deeper, 6 to 10 feet, say, I will fish either my Aqualux or Clear Intermediate or a Type 3. And I usually fish with quite a fast twitchy retrieve. So the strips aren't very long, but they're fast. So it's like strip, 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 like that. And often will elicit a take. If the fish aren't interested in a really twitchy, fast retrieve, then I'll slow it down. You know, sometimes maybe just a really long, slow pull and then a pause, and then another really long, slow pull and a pause. You know, or strip, 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 and then a really long, slow pull and a pause. You just got to vary it up a bit. If you ever watch a scud swimming, they typically, you know, they're zipping around in different directions and so on, but they're not moving that fast. Like, you know, in a straight line speed, they're not that fast, but they can swim quite erratically. And that's, you know, where having a bead on the fly can help, especially a tungsten bead, because when you pause, it'll dive, and then when you strip again, it pops back up and so on. So yeah, I'm getting pretty excited thinking about fishing those scuds this spring, and you know, hopefully you guys will try them too, and get some tight lines and have lots of fun. So I'm just going to look on the comments and see if anybody had anything to say that I need to respond to. I don't see anything. Yeah, it says works well on bigger hooks. Yeah, I will tie them up to like a size 10 scud hook. The Straggle's a little bit short for that big a scud. And I'll be honest, you know, even though there's bigger scuds around, when I'm pumping them, I'm finding a lot of small ones. So the Straggle's really good for the small ones. You could use regular Polar Chenille on the big ones and then clip it back to just make it a little bit shorter. Some people use crystal chenille. I find it a little bit too dense. I really like the Straggle. And you know, obviously you can use, you know, Sow-Scud dubbing and or seal's fur, things like that, which I did for years. But you know, I just started using the Straggle a couple years ago for tying scuds, and it's worked really well for me. And as you can see, it's really quick and easy. So if I don't see any other questions, I am going to wrap it up and wish all you guys a very happy Easter, and hopefully everybody will get out and maybe wet a line this weekend, and I'll see you on the water. If you're ever at Tunqua Lake, which is up in British Columbia, Canada, for those of you that aren't from around here, we are in the 3rd cabin down from the resort. Feel free to pop in, say hi. Maybe I'll see you out there. If you hear a dog barking, going crazy, and it happens to be a yellow lab, that'll be Sadie with me. Anyway, good night, everybody. Take care and tight lines.